So thanks everyone for joining. This is the 34th meeting of the IBWG. We're actually coming up on 10 years as of March next year. And we'll have a session next meeting on where we are in the IBWG and where we should go in the future. But for today, we're going to focus on discussion of the State of Play report. So thanks again for your time today. Look forward to a good discussion. And I will pass it over to Chad.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks really to all of you for being here today, continuing to show up at IBWG meetings, the familiar and the new faces. And I'd also like to say thanks to Catherine Lafleur, who, with Ria's capable help from our team at Infrastructure Canada, helped serve the co-chair role during my absence from January to August this past calendar year. But speaking of this past calendar year, I thought it might be a sort of a seasonally appropriate moment to, in a sense, like a family kind of seasonal Christmas letter, to do a quick little recap about some of the things that we've experienced in just setting a bit of preface for our call today. And I thought it's pretty important that we ensure that everybody knows that on November 24th, the National Adaptation Strategy and the Government of Canada Adaptation Action Plan were released. Available online. We've shared actually with members of this group the distribution of summary in English and French of some of the key points from that adaptation strategy that are relevant to resilient infrastructure. And the development of that adaptation strategy was informed very much by experts, including people like my colleague, Dan Sandink, and others who participated in advisory groups to help form that strategy, as well as Canadians writ large. And it sets out key goals for our nation and objectives, targets, indicators, and there's a 90-day comment period as well on that. I also wanted to mention that with the announcement of the NASC, there was federal funding announced for toolkits, about $97 million over the next 5 years to stand up open climate-related toolkits to help enable capacity building and decision-making, the kinds of things that we advance here at IBWG. We also received news of the funding successful announcement of about $59.5 million over 5 years for standards, codes, that type of guidance development that you will have seen presented here at IBWG by the National Research Council and the Standards Council of Canada. Great to see some of those folks here on this call as well today. So there are a number of things that were important to announce then. But if we look a little further back before November, in June, we had the announcement from our Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, of the funding for the National Research Council and the Standards Council to continue to work on their climate resilient infrastructure types of guidance. And that, in a way, I think was in between, if we think about the terrible Hurricane Fiona that affected the East Coast, and actually just prior to this calendar year, the November 2021 BC floods in atmospheric rivers. So this past year has been eventful in good and bad ways. And I think the one thing I also wanted to mention was that we've soft launched a projected future climate design values explorer. So what this does is it gives us, in the engineering types of variables, a projection of how hot and wet and other climate conditions it'll be for over 600 sites across the country. And it's online now, thanks to the work we've done with the National Research Council of Canada, but also with Environment Climate Change Canada. And it's located at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, their Design Value Explorer. So just looking back, I kind of wanted to share a few of those things that help set the ground for us. And just before I turn it over to start introducing our main presenters for the afternoon, I did want to ask a question to my co-chair, Dan, right out of the blue. Dan, knock, knock.
Who's there?
Murray.
Murray who?
Merry Christmas and happy holidays to all of those on this call just preceding the holiday season. That was my attempt to be a little bit cheesy, but thank you very much for all being here, our collective attempt. So we do have a very special session today, and thankful for participation from WSP and the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. As you know, they are the team that's updating the IBWG State of Play report on climate adaptation. This was first published in 2017. And I remember Peter and others working really hard, Christine, in regard to the first iteration. and it outlines opportunities and barriers to advance resiliency in Canadian infrastructure and buildings. We last heard from them at our last session in October, presenting their findings from their interviews on the research process. So today we're fortunate or lucky to have Peter Nimrichter, Christine Zimmer, and Leanna Augustin from the project team to provide us with an update on the state of play report and findings to date, with opportunities for input from all of us through the call today. I'd now like to pass it over to Leanna, Peter, and Christine.
Thanks, Chad, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly here. All right, can you let me know if you see that? Great. All right, well, thank you all for being here today. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Today, we're going to be looking at an update on the state of play report that we've been working on and focusing on some of the recommended solutions that we've developed and looking to get your feedback on these solutions, as well as feedback on the ranking criteria that we've developed to help prioritize some of these solutions. So for the meeting agenda today, we're going to start with a brief introduction, looking at the objectives of this 2022 report, getting insight from you all from the October meeting that we've had to help align with the national adaptation strategy within this report, as well as helping to meet your 3 to 5 year work plan. We're going to look at what we would like to hear from you today. So focusing on those recommendations and also prioritizing these solutions. We're going to look at the report process, so specifically how we've aligned this with the 5 pillars in the National Adaptation Strategy. And then we're going to look at some of the progress that's been made since 2017. Some of this was discussed in our October meeting, but we've added some additional information from the desktop research since then. And then looking at the recommended solutions. So for each of these 5 pillars within the National Adaptation Strategy, we're going to look at a high-level summary of some of these solutions. But we also have a summary table that I think was provided in the meeting invite. So I'll just pull this up here. It should look like this. So if you could keep this open as we go through the presentation, keep this in mind. This is going to help understand some of the more detailed information for the solutions within these 5 pillars. So once we get to discussing these recommendations, you can take a look at this and we can discuss some additional recommendations that could be added, some refinement to these recommendations, or also looking at which kind of recommendations should be prioritized more than others, and so on. So yeah, just keep this in mind as we go through. And yeah, the last thing we're going to do is look at the criteria that we've developed for prioritizing these solutions and getting your input in terms of how we could be possibly ranking these solutions based on this criteria, maybe revising these criteria, and so on. So looking at the objectives of our 2022 report, what we heard from you all from our meeting in October was that you wanted this to be aligned with the National Adaptation Strategy. So within the report, for the gaps from 2017, as well as the existing gaps and challenges, the progress, as well as the recommended solutions, these have all been aligned with the 5 pillars within the National Adaptation Strategy. We've also focused on recommending solutions or recommendations to help with your 3 to 5 year work plan within IBWG, as well as recommendations to support the NASA's short-term and medium-term objectives. And since our October meeting, we have developed the draft state of play report, and this has incorporated desktop research as well as key informant interviews and surveys. We've aligned it with NAS, and we've looked at identifying some recommended solutions for these NAS pillars. And we've also attempted to rank these solutions based on 3 considerations or criteria that we've developed. So today what you'll hear from us is we're going to go through a high-level summary of the progress made in closing gaps from the 2017 report. We're also going to look at some case studies and tools and solutions to help advance adaptation efforts. And then we're also going to look at that criteria for ranking these solutions or recommendations. And what we would like to hear from you today. So again, this is going to focus on the solutions or recommendations that we've come up with. So once we get to that, we can go through that summary table. And if you have any other suggestions for recommendations, please voice that. You can unmute yourself or raise your hand and we can discuss, or you can also put it in the chat box. We also have a work plan that was provided in the meeting invite. So if any kind of solution or feedback comes to you after this meeting, you can always fill that out and send it back to us at a later date. And yeah, we'd like to get your input on prioritizing these solutions. So looking at the 3 key considerations we've developed, looking at the ranking that we have, and getting your input on that and seeing if you resonate with this type of criteria. So for the report process, this is aligned with the RMBI from NAS. So we have 5 different pillars that our report is organized by. So we have technical, policy and legal, social, financial, and governance. And if you look at the table, let me just pull this up again. So within NAS, there's 3 different outcomes. So we have the long-term objectives or outcomes. So that's for 2050. The 2030 medium-term objectives, and then the 2028 short-term outcomes and sub-actions. So that's how we've organized our report, and within that we have these 5 pillars and then a couple sub-pillars within those. So yeah, that helps to understand how we've organized both the gaps as well as the progress and solutions. Going to the progress that's been made since 2017, focusing on technical. So again, this is a high-level summary. The report is definitely more detailed, but we want to focus on some key highlights that we found. And within the progress section of the report, we organize this so that we're looking at the 2017 gaps that were identified and seeing what progress has been made within each of those gaps. So for example, under technical, one of the gaps that was discussed was a lack of formalized training for industry professionals to be able to understand standards and guidelines to be able to implement adaptation strategies. So one of the progresses that has been made under that is a few formalized training programs. So for example, Narcan's BRACE program, SCC's training programs for understanding their standards and guidelines, and EGBC's professional practice guidelines, that's industry specific to be able to understand standards as well as how to implement that on the ground. There's been the development of municipal asset management programs, such as the Municipal Asset Management Program and Municipalities Climate Innovation Program, or MCIP, both created by Infrastructure Canada. There's been an increase in improved availability and accessibility of climate data services. So for example, through climatedata.ca, the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, and Infrastructure Canada's Research and Knowledge Initiative. And there's also been some technical tools that have been developed, such as the Risk and Return on Investment tool. Going to policy and legal, some of the progress that's been made here. There's been a lot of different standards and guidance documents that have been created since 2017. So we've divided this by federal, provincial, and municipal. So within federal, there's programs or funding programs and guidance and policies such as Climate Lens, NRC's Climate Resilience Built Environment, Climate Resilient Buildings and Core Public Infrastructure Initiative, and Public Safety Canada's National Risk Profile. But of course, there's many more, but that's just a high-level summary of that. Under provincial policies, guidelines, standards, and codes, BC's technical circular was developed, which was huge, and then the BC's climate preparedness and adaptation strategy as well. And then also Quebec's stormwater management guide are some examples of some provincial strategies and guidance guidelines. And then there's also been progress in municipal direction on how to define a risk tolerance. And that, again, is a huge gap that was identified in 2017. So this has been done through PIBC's high-level screening guide, MCIP's building blocks of adaptation strategies, CERNAC's climate change preparedness in the North program, and so on. And then, of course, the development of the National Adaptation Strategy. Moving on to social. So there's been a lot of uptake of nature-based solutions, which have spin-off social equity and health benefits. And it's also been shown to be a great way to involve Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values within Indigenous communities or Northern communities. There's also been the development of the 2021 National Nature Prescription Program. So this has been a way to restore mental health and human health as well as nature while building support for investments in natural infrastructure. Provincial and municipal governments have adopted frameworks and programs that address equity and social risks and community disaster risk management. And the federal government has allocated financial resources for Canada's Northern and Indigenous communities to address and support community-based initiatives. And then for financial, there's been over 15 federal funding programs. And we have just a brief list of some of those here. So for example, the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, or DMAF, Greener Homes Grant, and First Nations Infrastructure Fund. Infrastructure's Climate Lens framework has also required a cost-benefit analysis and has encouraged nature-based solutions or green infrastructure. And utility providers such as EPCOR are collaborating with insurance companies to develop risk framework analysis. And then for the last pillar, governance, this we found it was difficult to find specific progress on this, but a couple of them here was the Federal Adaptation Platform, which has allowed for interprovincial networking and collaboration to allow exchange of knowledge for adaptation options and strategies. And this has included IBWG within this. And then also collaborative programs between nonprofit organizations and municipalities through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM, which have fostered relationships between various stakeholders to undertake a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. But yeah, moving on to the recommendations. Before we go into each of the pillars and the sub-pillars for these recommendations, this table provides a summary of the number of recommendations within each of the pillars. So it kind of gives you an idea of what we have so far and where there's pillars where there's a little shy of recommendations and where we might need some suggestions from you all in terms of what could be included in those areas. So if we go through technical, for example, we have 4 sub-pillars here. So we have climate science, which has 1 recommendation, knowledge capacity, which is 2, technology, tools, and data, which has 4 recommendations, and then green and nature-based solutions, which is 1. Under policy and legal, there's 2 sub-pillars. So standards, codes, bylaws, which have 4 recommendations. Legal has 1. Social has 2 sub-pillars. So social inequity is 5, and economic and business case has 1. Financial has 3, so public funding has 6 recommendations, private sector only has 1, and green and nature-based solutions only has 1. And then for governance, there's 2 sub-pillars, but we only have 3 recommendations for one of those pillars, which is government and NGO collaboration. So if you look at the subtotals down here, you can see that governance definitely has the least amount of recommendations, whereas technical and financial has a bit more. And then also looking within the sub-pillars, There's some sub-pillars that have more and some that have less. So for example, under financial, we have 6 for the public sector, but then only 1 each for the private sector and green and nature-based solutions. And same with for social and policy and legal. So as we go through each of the solutions within the next couple slides, if you could pull up that summary table, we could take some time to go through those solutions. And if you have any ideas for example, for governance or for the sub-pillar private sector under financial, if you have any ideas for recommendations that could be added there, that would be great. I mean, all recommendations are welcome, but we would love to get your input on some of these ones we're a little shy of. So yeah, so we'll start with the technical recommended solutions. So on the slide here, we just have one example of the solutions that's in that summary table. So that's national consistency and standardization of professional training. So that could be similar to SCC's standards to support resilience in infrastructure program. But if we look at the table here, you can also look at the one you have as well. So we have all of these. So you can take some time, read those, and then you can unmute yourself or put in the chat box if you have any recommendations for other solutions that could be put under this pillar.
Thanks, Leanna. Again, I think some of the, if you've had a chance to go through the table, again, based on your feedback, we wanted to align that, again, the gaps in association with the key objectives for both short-term and medium-term NAS objectives. So what you might want to scroll up again.
Yeah.
Leanna. So again, what we heard from you when we interviewed you and during our IBWG meeting in October was that you wanted to see some framework or some consistency with all of the different initiatives going on with adaptation. How does the work that we're doing in the state of play align with the NAS? And so again, to help support discussions that you're going to have in March around work planning and initiatives, we really tried to streamline the gaps analysis as well as the solutions around what those medium and short-term outcomes were for NAS to help sort of give some structure to those gaps. And again, what we tried to do is then looking at the short-term and medium-term objectives, look at what are the gaps associated with getting to those objectives. And so I hope that provides some clarity with this table. And then the subsequent row and column is below that Leanna was showing is the actual solutions that address the gaps that we've identified or that we heard from you. So with respect to the best way to engage, what we're looking for is, if you feel comfortable, offer your solutions in the chat. If you prefer, we'd love to hear your comments now. Feel free to raise your hand and speak. This is a really informal working session. We recognize that you're all really busy and that sometimes reviewing reports can be difficult. So please take this time to put your solutions in the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand and provide some thoughts. So with that, I turn it over to you. I don't know, Peter, if you can see chats, or if Dan can see people raising their hands. I can't see.
I can see both of those. I see a hand from Lise Coulter from MNAI.
Hi there. Yeah, Lisa rhymes with visa. Hard to pronounce if you just see it written, but follows the German rules of spelling. So I'm working with MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and I'm also doing research through Royal Roads University. And so one of the things that comes up through all of this is the desire for an increase in the application of, of natural asset management, natural infrastructure. And a huge aspect of that is foundational. We talk a little bit in this document about the need for, cohesive sets of terms. But there's an overarching narrative that those in the know, if you're a greenie, then green makes sense. But if you're not a greenie, then how does green make sense in the context of all of the work we have to do and the budgets we need to spend? So on this, I think that managing some of these barriers is actually educational. And there might be a need for initiatives that are higher level, top down, and some balance between communication and education, where a lot of the things that are coming from the ground up are diffuse and disparate and not cohesive. So if we want something that's going to be more cohesive, we need some educational initiatives and scene setting that's, I think, needed to provide a foundation if you want to grow that sector. Ideas? Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. As someone who works for a conservation authority, one of the challenges that we hear for our municipal partners is while they are really excited about some of the provincial initiatives such as OREG 588, which includes nature-based solutions into asset management, and the federal government's Infrastructure Canada Climate Change Lens, which encourages nature-based solutions. The stumbling block for them has been being able to understand or compare the performance of a wetland and parkland to gray and green infrastructure, and has also been the life cycle costing, which are both requirements under asset management, as well as, to demonstrate return on investment in the infrastructure climate change lens. So we certainly have, through our work at the Conservation Authority, tried to supplement and provide guidance as well as the risk tool, return on investment tool to support that so that there is an equal playing field. So I agree with you that an equal playing field of education is definitely needed. I think that there also needs to be some incentives or support for municipalities to require parkland dedication beyond sort of the traditional approaches, requiring that cost benefit, and for the political will to protect, especially in Ontario. We have some new legislation that's going to make it difficult to maintain and protect parkland. So any sort of financial investment or cost benefit analysis will be critical in Ontario. I'm not sure if others in other provinces have something to contribute with respect to the ability to protect parkland and natural assets in growth development areas. Could maybe comment. I don't know, again, Dan, if you see hands up.
I have, a comment here from Daryl Daniluk, I think kind of relating to potentially more work that could be done to refine the goals. So Daryl stated, you may want to engage with the provincial professional jurisdictions, e.g. lawyers, engineers, architects, regarding knowledge capacity needs and initiatives for practicing professionals and students. This could be considered a recommendation for IBWG specifically. These are organizations that we have not necessarily engaged in these discussions in the past. So that is a potential recommendation to consider. We also had just a practical question from Benjamin K. If they wanted to submit input outside of this forum, I believe they would connect with you, Christine.
Yeah, actually, as part of the, I want to say, welcome or invitation package to today's event, we did provide you with this table, and we also provided you with a worksheet. So absolutely, if you have ideas, and solutions, Please provide us with those comments. Feel free to scratch up the table or add your input into the worksheet and return it to myself or Leanna. And we should, I guess we can put in the chat our contact information. And we're certainly on the invite with our addresses.
Okay, I have two hands up here. Harshan from EGBC.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me all right? All right. So I have one comment. The timeline between short and medium, it seems awfully small, 2028 versus 2030. I don't know if it's because you guys are mirroring some of the actions from NAS, but certainly if you want to see if there's opportunities to kind of spread it out, I'd consider that. But in terms of my comments, I think Liana shared earlier as one of the, I guess, highlights is the availability and the proliferation of climate data services. I'd expand that to include provision of services in relation to climate risk management. So the climate data providers, they provide services to provide the data, but on the flip side, you need architects, engineers, planners that take this information and integrate that into the work that they do. Engineers in Geoscience BC has declared new areas of practice. One is called climate science. The other one is climate risk management. We have seen these areas of practice grow to the extent that the sum total of these practice areas include about 200 registrants, if not more than that. So I think that is one point that I think we can definitely include. And I would say, some of folks on this call, their day job might be, contributing to or influencing climate strategy, policy, risk management. So certainly that's gone mainstream. And I think it's important to highlight that rather than just talking about how climate data services has gone mainstream. So that's one point that I wanted to highlight. And then the second one is about governance. I hope that I'm able to articulate it right. So as part of the work that we all do as governments, participants within the context of civil society, we all have our mandates. It would be important to understand how that mandate relates to achieving these larger societal objectives in relation to reducing risk and improving resilience. For our example, engineers and geoscientists BC, we have the mandate to protect the public interest, respecting the practice of professional engineering and professional geoscience. Well, it's not that much of a stretch for us to understand that managing climate risk and enabling the management of climate risk through professional practice will contribute to EGBC achieving its mandate. And so, in essence, it becomes a very important consideration for all organizations to understand how their mandate is impacted, and on the flip side, how they can effectively deliver on their mandate by addressing this issue of climate risk and resilience. So that's my 2 cents.
Oh, great points. I absolutely think you're, bang on there, that I think people are more aware now of the climate data that exists, but how to use that to inform risk assessments is still something that we need to move towards. And absolutely, one of the things to help reduce legal risk is documenting decision making, because especially, I can speak from a stormwater perspective, there are less standards, prescriptive standards than in stormwater than in water and wastewater. So there are variations in acceptable levels of service and acceptable levels of risk across municipalities. So the need to document decision making is really important, particularly when looking at legal or common law risk and litigation. because the question will be, were your decisions feasible, or did you, did you look at, was the damages foreseeable, and did you take the reasonable actions to mitigate those risks? So I think that's something, to your point, absolutely. I think building, educational resources for risk assessment is definitely a growing field. With respect to governance, I totally appreciate that each player has a role and mandate. I think one of the challenges that we have seen is that people stay in their lane. And unfortunately, and I'll give the example again in stormwater, is that there are multiple causes for flooding, whether that's riverine or urban overland or basement flooding due to high groundwater and sanitary backup. And we can't stay in our lane. We have to work collectively. Because some of the solutions that we propose may impact other or have cascading impacts. And so I think what's been expressed by numerous stakeholders in the interviews is how do we get people to work together? Because people are really good at staying in their lane and focusing on their lane. But when it comes to adaptation, it really requires integration. And that's been challenging. And that's also been challenging, and Leanne's going to get into it when we talk about prioritizing risk, because so many of these solutions are not one player's role. So the federal government can give us money, but it's the municipality or the private landowner that needs to do the adaptation. And so that's, I think, been something that resoundingly came out of some of the discussions. I don't know if Ron or Peter wanted to comment, or if we want to go again to some of the chat questions.
We have another hand up. I believe Sarah Cunningham has something to add in.
Hi. I'm new to this meeting series, so apologies if this is out of scope, but I reviewed the document at a high level, and I was just wondering if consideration for things like managed retreat is out of scope for this work, because it's not just about where the infrastructure is, but where it should be long-term, and planning for the future, and providing off-ramps. So we're not trying to, win unwinnable battles. But I'm just wondering, is that type of work out of scope for an action plan like this?
If I could offer some perspective from IBWG, having been involved in the previous State of Play report. One way that the State of Play report would be used is to direct this group directly. And I think that's maybe a small part of the way that report was used. And more importantly, it was used as a reference document for a lot of organizations that were relatively new to the concept of climate adaptation. And it set agendas for work and reset and research, and was cited in a lot of policy documents along other reports as well. And so even if we're restating things that are stated elsewhere, the need for managed retreat, for example, coming from this group, it does hold a fair bit of weight. And so if there are critical policy areas that the IBWG is informing society on more generally, this is one avenue to get those out into the world.
So does that mean that perhaps like raising the issue of managed retreat as an option for, infrastructure decision makers to think about is something that you do think could be part of this? Or
I think it already is recognized in part. I mean, we have jurisdictions such as Newfoundland and Labrador, and I know Dr. Ali Khan is on this call, and he may want to expand on what I'm about to say, but there are jurisdictions that are recognizing where their hazards are now and where their hazards might be in the future, and actively planning, recognizing that interim hazard zone that has uncertainty associated with it, but they can already have already developed policies around what manner of development might be allowed in those areas. So there is already recognition of, as I say, where the hazards are now. There are mechanisms to postulate where the hazards will be in the future. Some provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador are kind of, I think, leading the charge in that, BC as well. Some of the other provinces, I think, are a little bit more hesitant about recognizing those kind of changes and the implications of recognizing those changes. And that's something that certainly needs to be worked on.
Thank you for that. Maybe Dan, after, like, offline, we might have a quick chat so I can just get up to speed a little bit more on and read any further background documents that might help me. The other thing that Harshan was talking about governance, and that really resonated with me, is if in a future version of the report we can articulate the importance of infrastructure in meeting multiple agendas that local governments, provincial, territorial, and federal government has. It's a leverage point for change on climate, sustainable communities, and disaster management. And I think that would be just framing it as an intersection where action in this area can have benefits in multiple directions would be powerful to help overcome those staying in the lane tendencies that people have. If we can sort of explain the systems thinking approach and why this is an important leverage point. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great points. Great points. I'm taking notes, and I'm glad we're recording so we capture everybody. Is there any other comments or chats, hands raised?
Hi,
Go ahead, Chad.
Oh, I'll defer to Ali. Were you going to follow something? Ali?
Yes, please. So I've put in the chat the link to the flood management strategy for Newfoundland and Labrador. So that explains what Peter was saying, how we're doing flood risk mapping to capture future climate change zones, how we're using that to evaluate infrastructure so that when we do any federal projects, we use that as a climate change lens. Also included in that is the flood management policy. So I've put the link in the chat to the document. They can look at that. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay. That's great. Maybe I'll jump Dan, but I'll be short because I see that Jay and Bertrand are coming after me. I really think this is really valuable work. And I just am reflecting on the EU's climate adaptation strategy, where they have 3 words that have stuck with me: swift, smart, systemic. And I think about in Canada, we've come a long way since 2017, but we really need to have swift learning, I think experimentation. And so it's a broad comment. One might be able to weave this comment under social or perhaps policy, but I think we need to have this sort of more rapid experimentation. I think IBWG plays a role in the exchange of the leading best practices, but in my mind, the climate, I think many of us feel the climate is rapidly changing, those cascading interdependent, and sort of the unknowns are becoming knowns. So I think we kind of need to pick up our game in terms of not just risk assessment, but the risk reduction measures and all the kind of interactions across the social environment, economic. So it's really a broad point, harkening back to EU, swift, smart, systemic. I'll stop there because I see other hands are up. Maybe Jay was after me.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, Chad, that's great. Especially I wasn't intending to sort of ride on your coattails, but I think that systemic part sort of triggers sort of where I was going to go. So I'm with Electricity Canada. So we represent corporate electricity companies, utilities, and others as well. And where we've had success, the most success, I think, in helping our members manage climate adaptation and how to incorporate that into their decision making is to sort of do that. Our members have pretty well established enterprise risk management frameworks through which they assess all risks, and so really what we've found is our members are, the adaptation, or what most folks would call adaptation, is mostly just considered operations. That's just how they do it. And the trick was, how can we take what we know about climate and about practices that address specific climate related risks, and incorporate that and sort of tailor those to be part of existing ERM processes, so that our members didn't have to become climate experts necessarily. But how can we sort of take what we need to know in terms of climate? And a lot of that is like projections, right? We can predict with some rigor what will come in the future. And I think that's sort of the new bit of it. The new part is how will the environment act on infrastructure, and how can we predict that will change? And so that was it wasn't easy, but it was a delimited amount of work that we were able to help our members do. And so I think that was helpful. So I see some of that in here. And so I think there's stuff that sort of rhymes here in terms of under the sort of standards, codes, bylaws section, that it seems like it's sort of acknowledging that. So anyway, without going on and on, I think that's helpful. I think that from a energy company, utility perspective, infrastructure, capital heavy industry, incorporating sort of the demystification, I suppose, of adaptation is not a new thing necessarily. This is how you keep your assets safe, and how you do a better job of anticipating what will come, and what is going to put your assets at risk. And I think that that sort of language, or that tone shift, really sort of the light bulb came on for a lot of our members of, okay, this is what we're doing. This is just vegetation management, or this is just stormwater management. We know how to do that. What you're saying is it's going to be a little different. And here's how we do that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. We have Bertrand and then Benjamin.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, everyone. Just had a maybe couple of questions, comments, all together. I'm just wondering about if in any of the group around the table there are any representative of the insurance industry in general, and I'm just asking because there's going to be there's a really strong connection between everything that is being discussed today and the insurance, and we can put in place a climate adaptation strategy somewhere. But if it's not in line with where the insurance industry is going to be going, what is going to be driving one or the other? We know it's often money that drives things around, but just wondering also the insurance industry is not waiting for governments to take action and go in one direction or the other. We have you're talking about a broader access to data. Insurance companies, they only work with data. They're probably using the data being made more and more available. So I'm just wondering, all the work that is being done right now, what are the connections with the industry world of insurance companies? Just general thoughts and comments.
Christine, did you want to respond to that quickly? And then we'll get to Benjamin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Great comment. Absolutely. Economy and insurance drives a lot of our decision making. So yes, we have engaged the insurance as part of the interviews, and you'll see that in the full report. So thanks for your comments. And just cognizant of time, maybe we can move to Ben's, and then we'll keep moving. So thank you for your comments. And please, again, feel free to send us your worksheet. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. And thank you for having me here. This is also my first time at this meeting. It's very exciting to be here and really exciting to see all of the different recommendations that have been identified. I guess my question is around next steps for this report. I see a lot of recommendations that kind of could be prioritized. We could say that this is an entry point. We can identify actions around achieving some of these recommendations. So I'm kind of curious as to where we're going next, and if we can kind of think about action planning.
Oh, you must be psychic, because that's exactly where we're going. So I'm really glad you said that. One of the feedbacks that we got from the 2017 report was that we wanted more prioritization. And so what Leanna is going to flip to now is sort of some criteria that we've used to start to look at how do we prioritize solutions. So again, just to step back, if you can please, we really love your solutions and your ideas. Please either put them in the chat or send it to us via email. If you are going to send it via email, please do so before Friday today, or Friday this week. Because we're trying to get them into the table and into the report, and then analyzed and synthesized into priorities. What we're hoping to do through this next part, and I'm glad again that you brought it up, is to try and find a way in which we can prioritize solutions to help inform, again, discussions with IBWG and other professionals in the space of adaptation. These are some of the criteria that we have set out. And in the chat, you'll see some questions that Leanna's going to guide us through. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Leanna and just make the caution that, again, because we're dealing with a broad suite of solutions, a broad suite of infrastructure and buildings, and it was so great to hear the comment about how infrastructure really has an impact on society, on the economy, on the environment. And so it really is that linker in climate adaptation. So glad that came out in two of those comments from members. We've tried to create a simple way in which to prioritize, and Leanna will go through that. But again, what we really like to spend this next portion of the time on is getting your feedback. And Leanna's going to share with you some of the pitfalls and some of the benefits of going through this criteria. Leanna?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And thank you all for your really useful insights. So yeah, this is what we've come up with. We have 3 different main criteria that we've created. So that's quick wins, greatest need and impact, and then also feasibility/complexity. And then we have 2 different subpillars within each of these criterias with an overarching ranking criteria. So we have high, medium, and low for each of these subpillars. So for example, if we look at quick wins, we have cost of implementation. This one's a bit confusing because the high priority wouldn't mean high cost. It would actually mean something that would be less expensive to implement. So in this case, an example of that would be a development of a standard, while low priority would be something like building of infrastructure, since it's more expensive to implement. And then medium would be something kind of in the middle. So for example, infrastructure study or master plan. And then the second pillar under quick wins would be the length of time required for implementation. So a high priority would be something that would be pretty quick to implement. So within the next 1 to 5 years, keeping with NASA's short-term objectives and their timeline. Medium would be 5 to 10 years. And then low priority would be something that would take over 10 years to implement. And then looking at greatest need/impact, we divide this into natural environment, so the direct or indirect impact on the natural environment, and then social environment that looks at if we were to not implement this solution, what would the risk be to the social environment? So that could include human health, risk of flooding or damage, or so on. So yeah, for natural environment, a high priority would be building of infrastructure, since it's pretty direct. Medium would be something like an infrastructure study or asset management plan, or maintenance of infrastructure. And then a low priority would be something like development of a standard, since it's not necessarily directly impacting the natural environment. And then for social environment, high would be that the lack of implementation would result in high risk of flooding or damage in human health. Medium would be that the lack of implementation would result in moderate risk of flooding, damage, and impacts on human health. And then low would be that not implementing this would result in low risk. And then for the last criteria, so feasibility and complexity, we have interactions among multiple levels of government or stakeholders. So high priority would be something that would have one priority implementer. So for example, like the federal government. Medium would be that there would be 2 priority implementers, and then low would be it would take more than 2 priority implementers to take it on. And then under social acceptance and implications, this looks at what type of land this recommendation or solution would have to be implemented on. So high priority would mean that it would work on public land. So it's more socially acceptable or less implications in that regard. Medium would be that the solution would work on hybrid lands, so a mix of industrial and commercial. And then low would be that the adaptation solution works on private property. So we'll go into the questions first, and then maybe I could talk about some of the challenges that I came across when trying to rank these solutions. So the first question I have for you is, does this criteria make sense to you, or does it resonate with you in terms of the types of criteria that we have, as well as maybe like the wording we have or anything like that? I see Pam's hand up.
I see Ron's hand up. You may want to, Ron,
yeah.
you want to comment on what was saying?
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. I thought just before we get into the group's questions and comments, which we're looking forward to, just wanted to give an added perspective on this prioritization process. I think we always have to ask ourselves, why are we prioritizing and what are we going to be using this for? And I think really it's to provide added guidance to this working group, but also all the different entities that this working group represents. So how are you going to be able to focus the attention on those particular solutions be absolute, it's intended to be qualitative, it's intended to be flexible, and it's intended to be informative to allow for this group to have a better means of communicating these 30 different recommendations going forward, which is quite a bit. And it's a means of really providing that added level of guidance. So just wanted to make sure that the group understood the thinking of our group in establishing this approach. So that's just a bit of underpinning to support what Leanna just presented.
Thanks, Ron. Pam, I think your hand was up first.
Just trying to hit all my buttons here. So I'm looking at the feasibility and I'm wondering if we are not challenging ourselves. Were you looking at a low priority is more than 2 priority implementers, and a low priority is lower priorities are solutions that involve mixed owners of property, let's say. This working group has been very good at challenging the status quo and pushing the solution space. And I have a feeling that many of the solutions that have to be considered for adaptation in infrastructure now need to push these areas. So for instance, if just an example, so if communities are looking to increase their electrification because they're shifting more of their energy burden to electricity from other sources, it's going to mean a lot of decisions both for the utility but also for the community. And I'm just wondering if we should look at maybe not every action, but certainly some of the solutions that we push are piloting in this area or pushing these boundaries so that we can provide that evidence of this is the challenge that is going to be faced, and these are other new challenges that come up when we try to do it. So that's my only comment on the criteria. Otherwise, I really like them. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point to address. I think especially with the priority implementer, that was also something we were challenged with, is knowing some of these recommendations. It's hard to know exactly like how many priority implementers there would be in the first place, and what actually is defined as a priority implementer or secondary implementer. So yeah, I think really diving more into what that actually means too would be useful.
Yeah,
And I
Ron,
think
did
it's
you want to
not-
add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think what we're looking at is anything necessarily that's going to downplay collaboration. I think collaboration is the cornerstone of being able to in the game, the more complex it can become to actually getting that through. But it's perfectly valid point to suggest that we do need to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, Ron, I think you cut out for me anyways. I'm not sure if you cut out for other staff, but I think to your point, it was a point earlier made when we were talking about gaps and solutions, that the NAS objectives, there's 2028 and then 2030, which are very close together. And so really part of the prioritization is to what are sort of the low-hanging fruit, quick ones that we can do, recognizing, to your point, that we definitely, and I can vouch for that, being in the ground, that it takes multiple stakeholders to create adaptation. When you look at the existing urban area, we have to engage property owners and multi-stakeholders. But to Ron's point, that requires more engagement, education, finances, all those sorts of incentives. So I think, again, to Ron's point, we're looking at what are those quick win actions, but again, noting that that doesn't mean that we don't do these other ones that require multiple stakeholders.
Looks like you have Alice next.
Great.
Thanks. Hi. So just looking at this for the prioritization, and then goes to also protection of existing or valuation of existing things. So whether it be buildings or natural infrastructure, we have a lot of focus, I think, on building new and building better, and that's much needed. But also in terms of embodied carbon, how do we value the existing infrastructure we have and retrofit and renew more? And in terms of natural infrastructure, how do we value and protect the natural infrastructure that we still continue to lose at an alarming rate?
Great point. And I think we tried to look at that under social, environmental, and natural environment. And I, as someone who works 20 years in the Conservation Authority, I absolutely agree with you. So great comment. Is there other comments with respect to the criteria, or Leanna, did you want to maybe highlight some of the questions to help, again, lead the discussion, or share your
Sure. Yeah, I see Sarah's hand up.
Yeah. Just super quick, and I think it was actually mentioned in the comments, under the social environment for the greatest need and impact, I feel like for the high priority, we really need to include something on the vulnerable populations. So if the impact is on vulnerable or marginalized populations, that needs to be a high priority. So we should probably reflect that in there somewhere. It'd be good.
That's great. Great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think moving on to some of the other questions we have here. So do considerations under each criteria make sense to everyone, or do they require any revisions? I think we talked a little bit about this, but maybe diving more into that idea.
Leanna, did you want to share some of the challenges you had, or did we want to talk about waiting? I'm just cognizant of our time.
Yeah, so so I tried to go through each of the solutions and rank based on this priority criteria. One of the main challenges I had was waiting. So for example, under quick wins, one of the solutions might have been a high priority under cost, but then a medium priority under the length of time required for implementation. So it was difficult to understand like what, if that would mean a high or a medium or a high medium. So yeah, maybe bringing that back to you guys, do you have any ideas in terms of how we could weight this based on the two different subpillars for each of the pillars?
And amongst pillars, right? So do you see greatest need and impact should be rated higher, for instance, than quick wins? To some of the comments that we heard about, just because it requires more than one implementer, we don't want to discourage not doing it. Should we weight quick wins, greatest need, impact, and feasibility equally? Or should we weight one of these criteria more than others? And then again, to Leanna's point, within the sub criteria, should one be weighted more than others?
I'll have to look a little more into this idea, but I have kind of a thought that there might be an interim step that could be useful, where we create some kind of work packages, some kind of action planning around these recommendations that say, here's where we're going to be taking action in these different spaces. The reason why I mention that is because I feel like a number of the recommendations, coming from space where we work with municipalities a lot of them have to say municipalities need to improve their data, they need to, climate data, they need to improve their policies, they need to improve in all these different ways that kind of impact adaptation, the sort of operating environment for adaptation activities, but then also the projects that get prioritized within communities themselves. So I wonder if there are common threads that kind of touch on a number of these different recommendations that can kind of get packaged together, and then it'll be easier to prioritize those sort of packages of, again, I'm not familiar enough with this right now to be able to really recommend kind of an exact interim step, but I wonder if there's something else that'll help us to organize common threads of activities that would then be easier to sort of differentiate among and say, okay, this is clearly where we need everyone to start taking action right now in this area, and then in these other areas we'd be more willing to seize opportunities as they arise.
Great comments. Yeah, I think to your point again, there are, and I think the past comment too is there are things that are quick wins that we can achieve in the next, and there are other things that are going to take a lot longer. Ron, did you want to add anything, or are there other hands up? I don't see any hands up.
Yeah, I was sorry. Just before we jumped in there, apologies. Getting back to Benjamin's point, are you suggesting that we define sort of the who, what, and when related to each of these actions and recommendations, and then see if there's commonality around those that we can kind of package them together? Is that where you were driving?
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly it. It's like who's going to take the action, and once we've thought through the process of enacting these things, then maybe we'll start to be able to prioritize them.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah.
I see Jay's hand up.
Yeah. Thanks. I think I was going to say essentially that is that it's kind of hard looking at these to say in the abstract one should be higher than another, but if there is and some things can happen, concurrently or in parallel, and other things would be a strict, a trade-off. We do this, but which means we cannot do this other thing. So I think that's why I'm struggling giving something more concrete here. But if that could be something that is maybe a next step to say, here's scenario 1, 2, 3 or pathway 1, 2, 3. in terms of what, given the priorities that have been identified here, which seem fine. I don't have no pushback for me, I don't think, on these. They seem fine. Then that would be easier to provide some more concrete feedback, might crystallize things.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Christine, do you know is this table provided in the work plan?
Sorry, you mean in the worksheet? No,
Yes,
I haven't,
worksheet.
but what we can do is provide you with the presentation material. And that might be helpful.
Yeah, because I agree. I think it's hard to know if these work until you're actually going through and looking at the solutions and trying to weight it based on this criteria. So I think if you get a chance to look at the recommendations or solutions, then look at this and see if it works, that's when you might be able to understand how there might be some shortcomings or where things could be changed. Does anyone else have any idea in terms of other considerations for supporting this evaluation?
So I see some good feedback in the chat.
I didn't put my hand up to chat. One idea, maybe it's off the table, but I like this idea about greatest need and the social environment. And there's a comment I see from Natalie from Uranos about equity in the chat. One other point in terms of greatest need is like where we know we need to rebuild or retrofit infrastructure, like where those opportunities are present. It maybe ties toward to quick wins. But I just think also, like Jay, I've seen billions of dollars that are needed in the electrical infrastructure reinvestment, and so we need to get those short-term decisions about long-lived assets to consider the future climate design values and data like soon, given the magnitude of funding. So I'll say something about greatest need and magnitude of funding potentially. It was part of the thinking that framed it, how we created the climate lens, where we spent our analytic time. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chad. Thank you. Alice?
Just to follow on what Chad was saying, and I think what you were saying earlier, Jay, and that coaching this is not anything necessary. I mean, while climate adaptation, of course, is new, but it's existing in our existing lines of work. It's good asset management is climate adaptation and good, any good asset management. So let's just follow on, because I imagine, a lot of our infrastructure is, is behind the times in terms of good state of repair. So if we catch this as not, because I think you get a certain amount of deafness when it seems like a new climate initiative or a new environmental initiative, and it's like, no, this is just business as usual, but doing business as usual to a higher standard because climate is coming upon us. So
that's a great comment. I think one of the challenges we have in stormwater is we've looked to the past instead of looking to the future. So we've been driving infrastructure design based on, looking through the rearview mirror instead of looking forward. And so that's a change and shift that we need to do. I've seen one of the comments in the chat that says, who is the audience? So great question. So the audience is IBWG members with respect to, helping to inform your discussions in March about priorities and work plan for the next 3 to 5 years. But it has also been an opportunity for, or the 2017 State of Play has also helped to inform other organizations like SEC. I believe NRC has also used the document. I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to add to that. So I think there are so many stakeholders in adaptation that, this is really meant to help us move forward. Dan, I don't know whether you wanted to add to that or.
Right. So a state of play means what is the state of adaptation for buildings and infrastructure in Canada? It's not necessarily targeted at a specific group. It's just to give us a sense in general where we are, and in the context of this report, where we've come since the last assessment.
I'd like to toss up that first report really had a lot of impact in a number of ways. But just to say, as we tried to make an argument from Infrastructure Canada that we needed a national adaptation strategy, it was documents like that 2017 report that set out recommendations for a wide array of actors in the country, municipal, provincial, federal, and nationally together, that helped kind of push some of the policy and support the funding requests we put forward. Yep.
So in essence, I think this is an industry communication, and I think that's how we should approach the messaging around this. But I think to the earlier question, it's far from a stupid message because each industry sector receives information differently. So at some point in time, maybe that's one of our recommendations as to how we better communicate this to different sectors.
And I have seen quite a few comments talking about, yes, the quick wins. I couldn't agree with the one comment about also needing to focus on, targeted, best return on investment. So with financial constraints that we all face in the adaptation playing field, I think being able to demonstrate return on investment and demonstrating risk reduction are going to be critical. Point noted, and I think that's something we'll have to try to balance in our report, is recognizing those things that can be quick wins as well as those things that still need to happen or where we have gaps. I think one of the things that Leanna had showed when she showed you the summary table, and some of the gaps that we had, or some of the pillars had less solutions, I think is a message in itself, right? That we absolutely have to grow the space in a certain pillar to equalize some of the advancements made in other pillars. I can't see, I'm sorry, I don't have my watch on me. How are we doing for time?
We're at 2:20, pretty perfect timing. Maybe just to reiterate next steps, if we could, in regard to this work, then we'll conclude this part of the meeting.
Yeah, so that's our last slide. I think, Christine, you could discuss next steps for the report, but yeah, I do want to thank everyone for your input. This has been really, really helpful, and I'll pass it to Christine.
So one of the things that we'll be taking in your thoughts and your comments, and again, we hope that you'll be providing us with your feedback by the end of this week, if possible. So feel free to send us an email or to use the worksheet and send it to us. If you are interested in reviewing the draft report in January, the report is roughly 60 pages and will be coming out early January. If you do have time to provide feedback and you're interested, please send an email to Catherine, and she will help us navigate through those that we will then forward and distribute reports through. So the idea is that we would have the report finalized mid-February, provide some communication materials around that, and then with the final products available in March to help support your discussions. Catherine, Chad, or Dan, or project team members, if there's anything you wanted to add?
To defer to my colleague Catherine, if there's anything she's really in your contact in our office on this work.
Yeah, I think we're good, but I appreciate everyone jumping in, speaking up, putting things in the chat. Like Christine said, feel free to fill in the worksheet as much or as little as you want. Really appreciate all the questions too. They help us kind of reframe our thinking and figure out what will be important to various audiences. And then once it is released, feel free to help disseminate this so that we can, this is all in the goal of moving towards action.
Okay.
Sorry. I was just going to ask one more thing. If you do have thoughts on those criteria for ranking of the recommendations, it would be good to know. I think there's some maybe opportunities to align them a little bit more with other sectors that are challenged with specific impacts of climate change. So, for example, private property actions are going to be really important for heat health risk in multi-unit residential buildings, for wildfire that sort of thing. So these are things that we could potentially bring to bear on as the team works to finalize the report.
Well, with that, I guess I'd like to turn Dan to the next little section and just really start off by saying thank you very much to CVC and WSP, Christine and Peter and Leanna for this really great presentation today and the work all that's been done to date on this really important project to update our past report and take it to new directions aligned with the NIS. And we really want to also thank the members of IBWG. It's you who make this dream come true. And as we extend that network and bring people in that we think should be here, contribute to the exchange of leading practices to advance resilient, natural, and built infrastructure across the country. In regard to the membership, I guess it was mentioned at our last meeting, in recognition of our growing size, I think sometimes we're clocking up to 140 members. We're really looking at new ways of facilitating the connection amongst the members. And so we would like to invite you to add your name to IBWG's upcoming member directory. I believe that Ria is going to post a link in Wonderful. It's live and dynamic. So you can tell this isn't recorded in a way yet. But this will become a publicly accessible database of leading infrastructure, buildings, construction, and other built environment professionals, and infrastructure environment professionals working across sectors. We see this as one important way by which we can foster this ongoing exchange. So you can reach out to each other and we can get the information that's needed to help with our respective work. With that, I should note that the information shared in this form will be publicly available. And you are invited at that link that was just posted to contribute your name, contact information, and professional interests, which would be then posted publicly if the interest amongst the group is sufficient. So Dan, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Chad. And just to wrap up, thanks again, everyone, for ongoing participation. As I mentioned earlier, we're concluding the 10th year of this group, and some of the people on the line have been involved from day one back in 2013. So I think here's to another 10 years, and we'll definitely have that discussion in March about going forward in this group, looking for new opportunities to connect this really diverse group together. Please take advantage of the public registry of participants, as Chad mentioned. This is something that we certainly like to promote. And that's it for me. Thanks, everyone, for your time once again.